us. This is Jeremy Gable. Jeremy is the dev and writer for this game, Watch Me Jump, which is nominated for an IGF award in the category Narrative Excellence. It is lucky to be alongside some games you guys might know, such as The Return of the Obra Dinn, Wander Song, and Genital Jousting, which is also in that category, which is pretty amazing. Jeremy began, and maybe is still, a playwright.
Yes.
Which shows in the wonderful dialogue from this game. He's going to talk a little bit about adapting from a play to a video game, right? And I just want us to think a little bit about agency in particular, right? We talk a lot about how video games are unique because they offer the player agency. I think for those of us who have played this game, you've seen that agency is this is a narrative thematic in this game, in particular Audra's agency and the consequences of her agency. So let's think a little bit about what video games can offer the player in terms of control and consequence, and then how they can be applied in the context of this game. And also, this really great question of like what video games can and can't be. This is a game that really, I would say, pushes the boundaries of what subject matter is covered in video games. So let's talk a little bit about that as well during the Q&A. But mostly, let's just listen to Jeremy because he knows more about the game than I do. So everybody, let's give a round of applause and a warm welcome for Jeremy Gable.
Thank you very much. Is everybody able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. I'm Jeremy Gable. I'm the creator of Watch Me Jump, which was a stage play before it was a video game. And I was asked tonight to talk about how I adapted it from a play into a game, as well as how it got nominated for an award at the Independent Games Festival. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Watch Me Jump, I do have a short trailer that I'm going to show. Not seeing that. Let me just there we go. Enjoy. First going to start by talking about Watch Me Jump, the play. And this came about in about the summer of 2015. I had heard a news story about Brittany Griner and Glory Johnson, who were two WNBA players who were engaged to each other, and they were both arrested for assault following a domestic dispute. And I realized that this was really the first time I had heard about either of them, and really the first time I had heard about any WNBA players in the news. And so I started doing some more look into the WNBA, and I found out some really interesting facts, such as the fact that the highest paid player for the WNBA makes less money than the lowest paid player for the men's NBA. And as you can see, apart from the very bottom of that list, it's a really large gap. The average salary for the NBA player is about $6 million, whereas the average salary for a WNBA player is about $70,000. And it's become a problem so much that a lot of the players will play for the WNBA in the summer and then almost immediately go to another country and play for that country's team in the winter. So they're basically playing basketball 12 months out of the year. It's become such a standard practice that the WNBA actually has a list on their official website that lets you know which players are playing for which countries. And in fact, some of those countries have been paying players to quit the WNBA and just play for that country's team full time. which of course is great for the players because they get more pay and they're actually able to rest. So a lot of these countries are taking our all-stars, our Olympic gold medalists, because we're basically paying them less than what an average dentist makes. So with all of that in mind, I threw together a narrative about this WNBA all-star named Audra B. Mills, who is about to become the highest paid basketball player in the world because she's considering quitting the WNBA and playing for a team in Russia full-time. But the night before game 1 of the playoffs, this scandal that is possibly going to derail her career gets leaked to the internet, and so she has to figure out what she's going to do from there. So I came up with the first draft of the play in about fall of 2015 and kept working on it, and in the spring of 2017 it had its first public reading at Theater Exile here in Philadelphia. It was actually directed by Brianne Barrett, who's here tonight, and is a fantastic theatrical director. Say hi. Now, the title Watch Me Jump actually comes from a quote from the Charlie Kaufman movie Synecdoche, New York, which, if you're an artist, I think that is absolutely a required viewing movie to see. And in the movie, a character, before leaping off of a building, says to the protagonist, "You've never really looked at anyone other than yourself, so watch me, watch my heart break, watch me jump." And the reason that it has that title is because whenever I start a new project, whenever I write something new, I want to try to do something that I've never done before. And typically a lot of my writing has centered around people who you would say are good people. They are honest, they are moral, they are trying to fight for what's good. And with Watch Me Jump, I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to write a play where people are a little bit more like how you and I may be in our everyday lives. They're allowed to be dishonest, they're allowed to be mean, they're allowed to not necessarily fight for what is good for society, but what they need in that moment. And it seemed to work, because as my favorite Steam review for the game noted, unfortunately, everybody in this game is a shitbag. You are a shitbag, your boss is a shitbag, your friends are shitbags, none of the characters have any redeeming features. Which it's worth noting, and it speaks to the nature of the story, it was still a positive review. So I'm going to use that Steam review to transition into talking about Watch Me Jump the game. And to do that, I have to let you in on a little bit of a secret, which is that playwrights do not make money. About 99.9% of playwrights are not able to make a living as a playwright in this day and age. A lot of them go into teaching, some of them, like me, have a full-time job, and a lot of them are going into television and are serving in the writing room for a lot of television shows. In fact, we talk a lot about how we're in the golden age of television writing, and it seemed to be coincidentally when a bunch of playwrights were being hired en masse into writers' rooms. However, my interest is not really in television. My passion is for games. And in fact, some of my favorite storytelling moments have been from some of the games that I've played in the past. But I'd never really considered being able to write for games until around 2013, when I had started writing this play D-Pad, which is about the gaming industry. And in doing my research for this play, I sat down with Carla Zamanja and Kate Craig of the Fulbright Company. That's Carla on the far right, Kate on the far left. And I just played their game Gone Home and absolutely fell in love with it. And they were very gracious with their time, and we sat down and we talked about a lot of things, including the connection between theater and games, which I'll go into a little bit later. But in talking with them and in working on this play, I started realizing that what I wanted to do is I wanted to write games. So I sent out my application to a bunch of companies and I said, I have zero experience writing games, let me write your game. And they all understandably said no. So this was probably about spring of 2017. This was about a month after Watch Me Jump had its first public reading. And I was sitting there and I was wondering, what can I do? I can't just make a game, so how do I give myself the permission to write games? How does that happen? And as I was asking myself this question, I was going through maybe my second or third playthrough of Undertale. It's a game that I deeply, deeply love. And as I was playing through it, I realized it's actually quite crude. Like, the walking animation is only 4 frames, it only has one resolution, which is 800 by 600, there's no mouse support, it doesn't run at 60 frames per second, and yet, this is one of my favorite games of recent years. And so I started doing some research into Undertale, and I realized that Toby Fox used Game Maker Studio to make the game. And I had this realization. I said, wait a minute. I have Game Maker Studio. I bought it in a Humble Bundle a few months ago. And so I stopped telling myself, I can't just make a game, and I started asking myself, can I just make a game? So I started going through the tutorials of Game Maker Studio, and I realized I might actually be able to do this. And so I gave myself the goal, and I said, a year from now, I want to make a game. But I knew that there was a lot that I was going to have to learn. I was going to have to do artwork. I was going to have to learn how to program in GML. I was going to have to learn how to make MIDI compositions. So I figured it was a good idea if the story was already in place, if there was already a built-in narrative that I could build off of. And so I took a look at all of my stories, and out of all of them, Watch Me Jump was the one that made the most sense. After all, it takes place mostly in one building, and there's opportunities for exploration, and it was a story that I hadn't seen in games before. We had had basketball games, but not games about basketball players. And so, with that goal in mind, to do it 1 year from now, I started work on it, and 12 months from giving myself that goal, on April 19th, 2018, which is the date that I chose because it was the anniversary of the Portal 2 release date, I released Watch Me Jump to PC and Mac. And then a few months later, on July 11th, which was the date that the Minnesota Lynx and the Indiana Fever were facing off, and those are the two teams that face off in this game, I released it for iOS and Android. So that brings us to how I adapted Watch Me Jump into a game. So in deciding that I was going to make Watch Me Jump, the first question was, how am I going to do this visually? What is the game going to look like? And I didn't have much of a budget. I didn't really have any resources. I didn't even have a drawing pad. I knew it was going to be drawing everything by mouse because I was poor and I hadn't planned on doing this. So pixel art was the thing that was going to make the most sense. It was the way that I was going to be able to do artwork that actually looked halfway decent. And so I started looking at some of the pixel art games from my youth that were still rich in story. Games like Maniac Mansion, Phantasy Star 4, Link to the Past, Monkey Island, as well as modern day examples of pixel art games with good stories, such as Undertale and Thimbleweed Park. So that was a pretty easy decision to make, but then when it came to how do I actually present the narrative of Watch Me Jump, that became a little bit more difficult. I had all these wonderful stories from games swirling around in my head, some of the ones that I showed and mentioned before. You had Portal 2 and Grim Fandango, The Last of Us Left Behind. And then there were other examples that I was loving at that time, such as The Beginner's Guide, Papers, Please, and Her Story, and The Walking Dead. And I came to the conclusion that there were probably two ways to adapt this narrative. The first would be to take what I had already created and make a bunch of branching narratives that just fanned out like a tree into all these multiple endings. One of the best examples being the 80 Days treatment, or Chrono Trigger being another wonderful example. But I knew because this was my very first game and I kind of didn't know what I was doing, that was probably a little bit too ambitious of a project to take on. So then the other idea was the Telltale model, which is that there is a preset narrative and there are these narrative choices that you can make, but they all end up coming back to the narrative that you've created. It's less of a tree and more of a stalk, which is not a knock against Telltale. I actually really enjoyed Telltale games, rest in peace. But for Watch Me Jump, it felt a little bit like cheating to do it in that regard. So I came up with a third option, which is that there would be a preset narrative. No matter what choice you made, you would get to the ending. But rather than doing what most branching narratives do, which is asking you, what do you want to do next? Instead, I was going to ask, what do you want to be next? And so throughout the game, you are given all of these choices and you can decide who Audra is. So you can decide that she is professional, you can decide that she is defiant, you can decide that she is vulnerable, or you can decide that she is a badass. So you're not really shaping a narrative, but instead you are shaping a personality. And after I made that decision, I was fortunate enough to find a really wonderful dialogue engine with the very bizarre name of Frilly Knickers, which was created by the programmer Juju Adams, who worked on Hyperlight Drifter. And that allowed me to format the narrative into Excel spreadsheets, and thus be able to present a very dialogue-heavy game in a way that made sense. So now that I've talked about how I adapted Watch Me Jump into a game, I'm going to talk about why I adapted Watch Me Jump into a game. Now, as I mentioned before, I had already been thinking about the connections between theater and gaming, and that actually started the first time that I played Half-Life when I was a teenager. And I was playing around with the console commands, and I found the no-clip code. And so I'm flying around the world, I'm going through walls, and I realized when I fly far away from a world and I take a look at it, it actually kind of looks like a stage set. And in fact, I would fly around and I would see a monster that was hiding behind a corner because it was waiting for me to come down a hallway to trigger it so that it could come around the corner and terrorize me. But before then, it was just patiently standing there, kind of like an actor just waiting in the wings for their cue. And I started thinking about the debug mode that I played in the Sonic games in my youth, where basically you were able to take any object in the game and put it wherever you wanted. And I realized that what I was looking at was an empty stage, that people were taking props and characters and set pieces and placing them on there. And it made me realize that one of the reasons why we call a level a stage is for that reason, that this is just an empty space, much like a theater that we put things into. And so I started thinking about the connection between the two, and I came to the realization that games are potentially more like theater than any other art form. Like if you take a movie or if you take an album and you play it, then you go back and you experience it a second time, and the art is exactly the same. Maybe your experience of it changes, but the art itself doesn't change. And likewise, it doesn't actually really need an audience. You can play a movie or you can play an album and you can walk away and it doesn't care. It's just going to keep on going. But games and theater share a certain spontaneity. No two performances of a play are exactly alike, and no two playthroughs of a game are exactly alike. And because of that spontaneity, theater and games are really two of the only art forms that can glitch. No matter how many times you rehearse a show or how many times you test a game, something is inevitably going to go wrong at some point. And one of the things that I love the most about these two art forms, and it's the reason why I think I'm the most passionate about these two art forms, is that they require a very fierce interaction with the audience. If you're planning to do a show and no one shows up, the show doesn't happen. And likewise, if you start a game and then there's no one there to play it, the game doesn't move forward. So I've been seeing a lot of connections between theater and games already starting to happen. We have over on the top left the show Sleep No More, which is currently playing in New York, which has a lot of interactivity and interactive storytelling elements to it. We have plays that take place in a video game world, such as on the top right, Matt Cox's play Kapowie Go-Go. And even on the bottom there, we have Naughty Dog, which did a one-night presentation of The Last of Us, where they did theatrical presentations of various scenes in the game. And on the other hand, we have games that are taking place in theatrical worlds, such as Cardboard Computer's Game The Entertainment, in which you're a character in a play, the beat-em-up Foul Play, in which you're on a stage in front of a paying audience, and even Super Mario Bros. 3, which Miyamoto has confirmed was designed to look like it was a stage play. So to that, I add my game, Watch Me Jump, which is both a play and a game, and which I hope in its small way is going to help bridge the gap between these two art forms. Now, I released the game, it got one good review on Rock Paper Shotgun, it made a very small profit, and I figured that was going to be the end of it, and that was the end of that story, and I was going to move on to the next project, especially because I didn't have any connections in the industry, didn't really know where to send the game. Like I said, I kind of didn't know what I was doing. But there was one thing that I knew that I wanted to do, which was submit the game to the Independent Games Festival. In my play D-Pat, at the very beginning, the protagonist wins an IGF award. I've been following the IGF for years and had bought games purely based on them getting nominations in this festival. So I submitted it, not because I thought I was going to get nominated, because I knew I was not going to get nominated, but just because I wanted to get the game in front of some people who I knew were influences in the industry, and that maybe one of them would play it and see something there and reach out. Sam Barlow was on the jury, and I was really hyped by the fact that Sam Barlow might play my game. So I sent it in, and thinking maybe I would get honorable mention, maybe, probably not, but maybe. And I'm used to playwriting festivals, where they usually reach out to you beforehand, and they say, congratulations, you're a finalist, and so make sure that you show up on this date, and don't announce it until we put it on the website. And so I got this Twitter alert that notified me that the IGF had announced their nominations, and I went, okay, great. I did not get honorable mention, but I'm gonna go check who did because I have predictions. And so I went to the website, and sure enough, on that list, I saw my game and my name. And I was at my work desk, and I literally gasped and jumped in my chair because that was not supposed to happen. But it did, and so I've been doing a lot of work and getting ready, and next month I'm going to be going to San Francisco to the IGF Awards. I'll be representing Philly along with Gossamer Games, which I'm very excited about. And I'll be there talking about Watch Me Jump, which is both a play and a game, and I'll be talking about the ways that I think theater and games can work together and learn from each other and grow together as art forms. So that is my last slide. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to open it up for some questions now. There's obviously a lot to talk about. What's up?
Microphone for the question?
Oh yeah, I'll put it somewhere. Here it is. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and ask a question. All right.
I really don't need a
Okay.
It's okay, but someone else needs it.
Oh, for the recording. Okay. Well, alright. So I was going to ask you, I know you said you didn't have a lot of experience in putting your game out there. You struggled with that. But were there any ways you did that, like running a Twitter or promoting it on social media? Because I'm curious about, because you did find success here clearly, and I'm wondering what methods you did take to promoting your game.
Yeah, I had social media. I had a Facebook and a Twitter that I was updating on. One of the things that I ended up relying on a lot was I'm part of the theater community in Philadelphia, and so it was kind of an unusual way of going about it, but I talked to the theater community a lot about the fact that this play that you know that's been out there for a while, I'm turning it into a game. And they were some of the first voices to post on social media and to talk about the game and to get the word out. And also, as many of them were non-gamers, it was very important to get their feedback, since I knew they were going to be the first players, to see, how does this game reach you, and what are ways in which me as a gamer mind am not thinking of the non-gamer. For instance, in the tutorial, I said to move, use WASD, and one of my testers said, what is WASD? And so I had to be like, right, okay, great, good, I can modify that language. So yeah, so it was social media and just relying on the kindness of friends.
It's cool, thanks.
Thanks again, Jeremy. That was fantastic. What I'm kind of curious about is having gone through this process, and my assumption is that this is your first game.
Yes.
Making it, but you have extensive. You love games, and you've been playing games for a long time.
Yeah.
Did this game achieve what you hoped to achieve in converting your play to a game? That's the first question. The second question related to it is there something aesthetically that's different that's reaching from the audience perspective? If I played this as a game versus if I watch the play, is there something that I'm getting differently reach that's unique to its own, method of delivery?
Yeah, great questions. First, I do believe that I achieved the game roughly how I imagined it to be, which was really relieving because there were several times in which I thought, can I actually pull this off? Especially when it started getting into the programming world, and then being able to figure my way out of any conundrum was really satisfying in a way that I've only ever really felt whenever I've had a playwriting problem, where I'm like, but how do I get this person to this place, and then I figure out the story beat that gets them there. In terms of Watch Me Jump the Play versus Watch Me Jump the Game, I think what the difference is in the experience is that in the play you're a little bit more at my mercy as a storyteller, where as you're watching the play, every time that there's a choice to be made, I make that choice for you. That I decide that this is what Audra is going to do, this is what Audra is going to say in this moment. Whereas with the game, you are given that choice. So while the actual synopsis of the plot would be about the same, as you're watching the play, you get to sit back and you get to let me make those story choices for you. Well, you get to have a little bit more control of the story.
And just one quick follow-up question then. What would be, is there something that you felt like that's done much better with the play format versus the game format? Or should all play be rapid?
So for the recording, the question was, is one, if I'm getting this right, is one preferable to another? Should all plays be in the game
Or is there
format?
something about play form that's like, this is the story that I have to tell to a play.
Mhm.
It just can't be achieved through a game.
Yeah, and I do think there are some stories that I've written that I don't think would be very good games. This one, it felt like the narrative opened itself up to allow those choices. And I think one of the things that made Watch Me Jump able to be adapted into a game is the fact that my first instinct with the narrative was to make everyone's motivations a little more ambiguous and a little less good. Because one of the things that annoys me the most is when I'm doing a branching narrative in the game, and it's like, do you want to do the good thing or do you want to do the bad thing? It's like, well, of course I'm going to do the good thing, because that's the good thing. So I enjoy the games that are like, do you want to do the maybe kind of good but not really thing, or the other maybe kind of good but not really thing, and then I have to make that choice. As far as should all plays be interactive, or should all plays be turned into games, honestly, I kind of love that. I don't know if that's where the future of theater is heading, but I do think that is a future of theater. And I know that it would take a lot of work to get a lot of theater-going crowd into that camp. But it's something that I'm really excited about, the idea of being able to create a story and then hand it off to someone and let them take the reins of it.
So with your love of immersive theater and then also immersive experiences with games and the agency for a player, have you thought about making an immersive theater experience for Watch Me Jump? In some way having the audience decide in the way that the game lets the players decide?
That is so meta. Oh my
Because there are a few immersive theater experiences that do let the theater decide, like
Yes.
they choose. So I was
Yes.
curious if you had any thoughts on potentially doing that.
So in terms of Watch Me Jump, the game to play.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I haven't really thought of that because I think the thing that doesn't entirely interest me is bringing an audience into a theater and then having them en masse try to choose, do you want to do one or do you want to do the other? I have been a part of those experiences, and ultimately it gets really disappointing when you're like, well, I want them to go left, and then they go right. It's like, but I really wanted them to go left. What I'm more interested in is perhaps something along the lines of A Sleep No More, where the entire world is built, the entire construction has been made so that you are able to, if you want to go with the group, you can go with the group. If you want to go into that room, you can go into that room. Or if you want to say, I have no interest in that, I'm going to go into this room and start looking through books, you're allowed to do that as well. I think that that potentially is more where the future of interactive theater is heading, rather than just, for lack of a better word, not to downplay this, but more of a choose your own adventure type of theatrical experience.
Hi. I know that you were previously talking about like how you noticed that there were no stories in games that were talking about basketball players and their stories, and like I'm inclined to agree. I don't believe I've ever consumed any media besides the news that has gone into that kind of detail. What were some of the the challenges and some of the things that you realized while writing this kind of narrative?
I'd say one of the biggest challenges is because I like basketball, but I've never followed basketball, is being able to actually get the jargon right. And because I was writing about people who they don't just play basketball, but they live basketball. And so how do they talk about basketball in a way that other people would not? And that's always one of the biggest challenges when I was writing about the game industry. How does a game developer talk about games in a way that some blue-haired person sitting in the theater would still be able to understand? And that was the same thing with making Watch Me Jump, was be able to actually make a believable narrative about basketball players when I'm very much not one.
Now that this game has found some degree of success, have you considered adapting any of your other plays into video games?
No, I actually, the next project that I'm working on is an entirely original story, because I do think one of the things that was really nice about being able to adapt Watch Me Jump was that it allowed me to actually figure out how to make a game. But I did find myself limited by the story, that I really did feel like because I had to figure out all these mechanics, I was limited in this story and wasn't able to branch out in the way that I potentially could have in that 80-day style. So with this next game that I'm working on, which I'm in the very early stages of, it's going to be an entirely original story, which is going to allow me to actually create it from the ground up with gameplay in mind.
Hi, thank you so much again for coming here and telling what's honestly a really inspiring story.
Thank you.
I thought this was so cool, and the more that I learned about the story of this game, the cooler I think it is.
Thanks.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One is sort of as a playwriter speaking to a room of more game designers, do you have any advice on how to go about learning to write like dialogue and pacing? Because one of the things that really jumped out to me in the playthrough was just how natural and like fast and fluid the pacing was, which was I think one of the treats of getting to watch a playwright write a game. So I was wondering if you have any tips for learning how to write better.
I mean, the biggest tip that I have is just to start doing it. Just keep doing it, get it in front of people, hear their thoughts, and then two, start really picking apart the writing that you do like. Something that I highly recommend is Pixar has their 22 rules of storytelling. It's available on the internet. It does kind of explain why a lot of their stories follow a very similar structure, but I think within that are some really amazing tips on how to get started writing a story and how to think about storytelling as you're going through it. But I would say, one of the early things when I was learning how to be a playwright is I was watching the Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I realized this is a really concise plot. And so I took Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and I watched it a bunch of times, and I wrote down scene by scene, like this is how a good story is structured. And that taught me so much that I'm able to take into my own thing. So I would say just anytime you find a good piece of writing, whether it be a movie or a piece of theater that you've seen or even a game, just take that element, take those writing elements and dig into them. And rather than just, admiring the writing, ask yourself, what is it specifically that makes this writing work? And then just keep working on your own to try to get there.
And I have a second question
Yes.
that I don't know if you want to answer, but I am very curious if there is a second ending to the game, a secret ending.
So there is one secret ending that is, and not to give too much away, but basically to ask the question, how can all of this be avoided? The answer is if she doesn't go to the bar at all. So if you can figure out a way in the game at the very beginning to not have her go into the bar, then you get the secret speedrun ending.
Has anyone found it yet?
There's one person I know of, based on the Steam comments, that has found it. So there's that ending, and then I've also snuck in a personal note for myself into the game that I do not believe anyone has found yet. So,
All right.
so happy hunting.
So, what are the difficulties adapting a play into a game? Because one is very linear, and the other you try to like branch it out and make it a more choice-based narrative. So, was there anything lost in translation in like adapting into a game? Because a lot of games are adapted from books or previous written books.
Yeah.
How did you go about it?
So for me, it was really just going through the script of the play, and every single time I felt like there was a point where Audra could have done this or she could have done this, then I wrote that down. And I said, well, what would happen if she went this way instead of that way? I think one of the challenges in doing that, specifically with this narrative, was that in making the play, I had already built this house of cards. And so I knew that if I said, can she do this? And then she went too far that way, I would take out one card and then everything would tumble. So I had to make sure that every choice was able to lead us back to, for those who have played it, to her going back to that bar at the very end. I think that's something that, again, 80 Days, perfect example of a game based on a book. And what they did beautifully was that they just started with the two cards at the top and then built from the top to the bottom. Which is definitely what I'm interested in doing with the next project. But yeah, I think that was the biggest challenge. I don't think if you played the game, then I don't think you've potentially lost anything from the play. I think the play follows in a pretty similar theme. But yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges in adapting it, was just trying to maintain that house of cards while giving the player choice.
I was just wondering, as a writer, how do you know the story's finished? How do you know this is the story you want to tell and stick with it? What helps you do that?
That is a wonderful question, and in some ways I still don't entirely know how to answer it. So when I had said that this was really the first time I had heard about Brittany Griner and Gloria Johnson, I had heard a WHYY like 5-minute story on Brittany Griner maybe about a year or two before I decided to sit down and write the play. And I just went, WNBA, interesting. And I went into the bank because I didn't know what the story was going to be. And it wasn't until that domestic dispute happened that I realized this is the only time that I really hear about them in the news and not just some piece on a radio station once. So for me, that was the click that said, okay, I think this is a story that I'm going to start working on. And the way that I generally work as a playwright is I just start from the beginning, and then I just start going. And I see what developments happen along the way. And so the way that I know that the story is done is that I get to the ending. And there are a lot of ideas that I have in my head that are still waiting for the story, that don't know what the story is. And then I have even more stories that I have 30 wonderful pages of, and I was never able to get to the ending because I was never able to see what that was.
And I guess just a separate question, if you could turn a play you did not write into a game, which one?
Ooh, that is a wonderful question. You know, I would probably say, if any of you know this play, Angels in America, which was turned into an HBO movie, I think that would be such an amazing adventure to go on. It's this sprawling, it's a two-parter, it's like a sprawling 7-hour masterpiece that takes place in New York in the 80s, and just like, it goes up to heaven and hell and all the places in between, and yeah, it is a truly epic tale, and I feel like that is maybe one of the few plays that would be deserving of a truly epic game.
Thank you.
I just kind of had a question, coming off that, where you know when to stop. When you're starting, do you, like, one of the things that definitely caught my attention when playing through the game is just how strong the characters are and how well defined they are and like their personality. How do you start developing a character, I guess? Do you, both how do you start, and then do you first start with developing a character and then go on to tell the story of them interacting? Or is it you have a story point and then develop the characters from there?
It really depends. Sometimes I have the character, sometimes I have the story. So with D-Pad, I knew I wanted to write about the game industry, and that's where I started from. Whereas with Watch Me Jump, I knew I wanted it to be about a WNBA player, and then I started from there. One of the things that's helped me out, being a part of the theatrical scene here in Philly, is that I can start potentially with an actor. So for instance, all of these characters in Watch Me Jump, I had an actor in mind when I had started writing that role. And so I was able to go, okay, well, I know that Aimee Kelly has a certain personality, so Audra B. Mills can be molded around that kind of personality, because I think that's going to pair really well on stage. So ultimately, I have sort of basic characters, and what I do is I start at the beginning and I just start putting them in rooms together and seeing what happens and realizing, oh, I think, you know, this person is going to feel this way about this thing, and this person is going to feel this way about this thing, because that's really theatrically interesting. And now I understand a little bit more about this character, and that's going to inform what they do down the road. One of the biggest examples is being Zach, the assistant coach, who at the very beginning of the play, I didn't really know what their relationship was. I just knew, here's Audra, here's Zach, and I just kept working scenes, and this was probably the biggest thing that went through multiple drafts, was the relationship between Audra and Zach, because I would try them as this kind of relationship, and that was fine, but that didn't quite work, so maybe I tried them as this kind of relationship. And with each iteration, I got a little bit more of an understanding of who these two characters were, so that by the end, I knew as much about them as they knew about each other.
So for like narrative-driven games or something like this, how did playtesting work? How does one eliminate bias? Because if you had the same playtester coming in, they would know what the story is, or they would have played until a certain point. So how would you know that the reactions are right, or like without the bias?
Well, it was trying to find as many different people as possible as I could. I found people that were very experienced gamers and people who had never played a game before, people who knew the play of Watch Me Jump and people who had never experienced the play of Watch Me Jump. And it was basically just hearing all of their input and getting all of their feedback until I knew that I had a game that could interest you whether you knew Watch Me Jump or not, and whether you were a gamer or not. So yeah, it was just trying to find as many different viewpoints that could come into this, both as a play and as a game, as possible.
Excuse me. Are there any mechanics that you would like to experiment with to communicate story or things about characters through solely just some other kind of mechanics besides branching narrative dialogue options.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of the things that I mentioned before are really beautiful examples of non-narrative storytelling, which, again, being a playwright and dialogue being my forte, this felt like the most natural element to play in for my first game. And the next game is also going to be dialogue and choice heavy, but it's something that I keep looking at and I keep experimenting with, and I just need to keep working and keep learning and keep getting a little bit better before I can learn how to make a game that manages to tell you a story without telling it. It's actually one of the things that I love about Return of the Obra Dinn, which is just a phenomenal game, is the fact that it tells you so much without telling it to you, and in fact forcing you to tell the story. And Gone Home was, of course, one of the first big inspirations of so much information is given to you by you just walking around the house and putting it together like a jigsaw puzzle. So yeah, that's something that I'm definitely wanting to explore a lot more and try to figure out how to do in my own work.
When you made the transition from play to game, did you find there was any character you learned something new or more about, or perhaps like a theme that kind of leapt out to you that you discovered new once it became a game? Was there anything, especially with thematics, that you found that you discovered, I suppose, when you were doing the adaptation?
Yeah, so one of the big things for me was in giving Audra choice, as a playwright, you make all of those choices yourself. And so in giving her choice, I found that I ended up giving her more choices that I wasn't even expecting, including a little bit of a spoiler for those who haven't played it, but the very, very last choice that Audra makes in the game: will you have another drink or will you not? Which is not something that's presented in the play. We don't know what her relationship with alcohol is going to be at the end of the play. That's just sort of left open. So the fact that you as the player are able to make that choice, is she going to have another round or is she not? That was a very surprising element for me to discover as I was going through it. In terms of other elements, I know that pacing was something where I learned a lot about the characters. In this dialogue engine that I was using, every pause had to be programmed. So every comma, every period, I had to put in a little bit of a pause so that the dialogue moved like dialogue, that that it would read the way that a person would speak it. But then the moment that Audra's agent showed up, I had to learn how to put in those delays, because otherwise the dialogue was just going to keep going fast. And then with her agent, I knew that I wanted her to burst onto the scene. It was a really intense moment that had happened just before, and I wanted her to come in to kind of give a little bit of a comic relief. And I realized if I just don't put in delays, and then you immediately get her speech pattern, which is that she just does not stop and just keeps going, and so that dialogue can just keep flowing. And that gave me a lot of insight into how that character interacts with the world, just based on working on the programming of it.
Hi. When you're writing a screenplay, when you have a character, you will decide their personality for them. But since this is a game and the player is playing as the character, when you're writing, do you have a few presets of personality for the playable character?
Yeah. So basically, with each choice, it was I would ask myself, what are the two main ways that she would react in this situation? One that comes up a bunch of times throughout the game is someone says something to her, and is she going to be nice or is she going to be honest? Someone mentions another player, and is she going to politely dodge the question that, go around the fact that she's not a very good player, or is she going to be honest and say, well, I'm better than her, so that's why this happened? So yeah, that was the interesting part of making this a playable character and being able to shape the personality, was trying to figure out what are some of the polar opposites of how someone would react when presented with a question or a response.
I had a question kind of coming off my last one. So when you said that you had these, I guess it kind of sparked off when you said that you had the actors in mind. I guess, is there a reason you decided to go for a text-only interface versus including any voice acting of any kind or having any voiceover? And is that something you're interested in, or do you like having just the text and kind of the person creating their own voice?
So that was something that I thought about, because especially the moment that you start telling actors you're making a game, they're like, can I be in it? Do you need a voice? And with Watch Me Jump, it was a very specific choice in the fact that this was a text-based adventure. It was, based off a lot of the look of Maniac Mansion, and it felt weird to have voice actors in it. So one of the other nominees is Unavowed, which if you played it is a throwback to some of the point-and-click adventures of the late 90s. And for that, voice acting works beautifully because it feels like it's part of that world. Whereas this, I felt like voice acting might not quite fit. It's definitely something, because I have a lot of actor connections who are all wanting to be a voice in the game. It's definitely something that I want to start doing. But right now, with kind of the rudimentary looks of the games that I'm doing, it feels like a text-based narrative where you're able to put your own voice into it feels more suitable.
Coming off of that question, sorry. No, you can't talk. Do you have any other people or artists or anything that you want to collaborate with in the future?
Yeah, I mean, right now, so whenever I do something brand spanking new that I've never done before, I tend to go it alone, just because if it crashes and burns, then I'm the only one that takes the fall for it. But yeah, as I start to figure this out a little bit more, I definitely want to work with artists, because I don't know if you know, but that is not my strong suit. But yeah, I want to start working with more artists, more programmers, and start trying to figure out how to do a little bit of what I was talking about with the non-narrative storytelling, being able to branch out and try new things.
Yeah, I have another question. So you've talked a lot about how you've worked with dialogue in this game, making it interesting and how it branches and how it informs the player, the character. And I've always been a fan of the silent protagonist and how games have done that really well.
Oh yeah.
Not a lot of games do that very well, but I love when they do. And I'm curious on your input on your opinions on the silent protagonist at all, and what games you like that have done it really well, because I always found that to be the best way to insert the player into the character and make them feel like they're going on the adventure.
Yeah, no, I am a humongous fan of the silent protagonist. I mean, the first time that I played Half-Life, that just blew my mind, the fact that there were no cutscenes, that you were just moving from place to place and people were talking to you, but it felt so immersive. And if I have a favorite game of all time, it's Portal 2, in which you are the silent protagonist, most likely because characters won't let you get a word in edgewise. But I have always loved that element of it, of the immersiveness of being able to basically add your own dialogue into the experience, because one is not being made for you. So yeah, again, along with that non-narrative storytelling, again, Gone Home is another beautiful example of that, of a character that just doesn't speak because everything is being said for them. It's, again, another thing that I want to try branching out on and trying to figure out how to do, because I agree with you. I think that there are some really good examples of it, but they are few and far between, and there are some really terrible examples of it, so yeah.
Thanks.
Hello. I have 3 questions.
Oh my god, okay.
We only have a few minutes, so.
Yeah, they're pretty quick. In the play, is she, which of the 2 personalities is she? Is she like a, you can't say.
Yeah, so she's definitely the more defiant personality in going off that thing of allowing people to be dishonest and mean, to allow her to not say whether or not she's paying someone off, or if someone says you have to do something, her being like, no, screw that, I'm not going to do that.
And the music, you did that all yourself?
Yes.
What kind of program did you use for that?
I used LMMS, which is a free program, which is why I used it. Yeah, and then just finding various plugins that allowed me to get the sounds that I wanted to use.
Okay. And then number 3, race cars or Blueberry Muffins?
Blueberry Muffins. I don't really care about race cars. I'm all about muffins. Thank you. That is the hill I'm dying
on. So you know that video games are this very multidisciplinary medium, right? Music, visuals, writing. And often we get to points where you can't do something, right? In your case, program, etc. our students reach that all the time because some of them are siloed in certain disciplines. Can you just give some general advice about how to tackle a new discipline, whether it just be like mental advice or even just like practical, what resources, like how do you get over that hump of like, I don't know how to do that thing, but I will learn, right? Like could you give some advice on that, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, it took a lot of yelling at my computer. There was, early in the process, I had a bug that was breaking the game 5 minutes in, and I spent 2 full days on this thing. Any free time I had, I was going on this thing, and it was to the point where it was like, I don't think I can make this game because I can't figure out how to do this. And it was because I was using quotation marks in my Excel spreadsheet as opposed to 2 apostrophes. And the moment that I found that out, I was like, are you kidding me? So yeah, I think for me, in making this, the mental side of it was just that I had given myself that goal, and I had to achieve that goal. And I was just going to keep working until I did it, because the idea of exploring this new territory and this idea of being able to try something that I've never done before was so exciting that I kept that propelling me forward. In terms of practical, it was a lot of Googling, it was a lot of tutorials, and at the end of it, it was, and that's when I knew that I was finally getting the hang of it, when it was creative solutions. When I was like, I know enough of GML now that I think I can ask it to do this. And then I would, and it would work, and that was fantastic. So yeah, the only advice that I guess I really have is to just keep plugging away, to know when to step away from it, and take a walk around the block or play something to get your mind off of it, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And also, and I'm sure this is not something I need to say, but to think about this when you're not in front of the computer. Some of the best ideas that I had in making this game came when I was commuting to work, and I was just like programming inside of my head and going, would that work? Would that possibly work? And then on my lunch break trying it, and it worked, and it was amazing. So yeah, just keep plugging away, know when to think about it, and know when to not think about it. That's the advice I can give.
I think it's last call for questions now.
We'll do Chris and then Frank.
Yeah.
Hello, I just have a real simple question. What was your favorite part about making the game?
I would say probably my favorite part of making the game was it was the weird catharsis of you would work on something, and I would tell Audra, okay, you're going to go over here and you're going to open the door and you're going to leave. And then I would press play and she would just go off into some wild direction. I had no idea why. And I would yell and I would scream and I would spend an hour on it. And then it was that moment where she went to the door and she exited and closed it, and it worked perfectly. And I did it 3 times and she did it 3 times perfectly. It was that moment, that kind of catharsis that I don't think I've ever experienced before, where something wasn't working, and then it finally beautifully worked the exact way that I wanted it to. That was kind of that rush of dopamine that I just kept seeking. Like every time something would break, it was like, well, I will now fix this because I must. So.
I'll use my executive privilege as the director for the final question, which is in 2 parts.
Okay.
The first question that I have is, I'm kind of curious, because I'm sure you've had friends within your theater circle play the game, what their thoughts on it, especially if those who are not coming from gaming. And second, you're sort of talking about coming from play to game, but having gone through this process, I'm wondering whether there's any sort of lead effect of feedback of having made this game, kind of you might sort of see in writing your play in the future. Has the process of making the game, do you think might have an effect on how you approach in writing play?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of non-gamer theater friends that have played it, they were really into it, and I think one of the things that helped was being able to test it with non-gamer friends, because if I just said watch me jump and I dropped all of you into the hallway with Audra, you would know, okay, well, I'm going to use the WASD keys and I'm going to have her go, and then if I need to interact with something, I'll press E. And I had to tell them, this is how you're going to play the game, this is how you're going to experience it. This may seem rudimentary, but for you it may be new. So I think the fact that, especially at the beginning, I sort of handheld some of the non-gamers through it, I think helped them with the experience, and then they were able to get into the groove of it and get through the game. So the response on that has been really positive. In terms of the second part of the question, yeah, I haven't written a full play since I've made this game, but I have been wondering what that's going to be like when I go back to it, because like I said, when I wrote Watch Me Jump, I made a choice for Audra each and every time. And now I'm wondering if I'm going to go back and there's going to be a choice, and I'm just going to keep like figuring out, but there are 2 other choices that this person could make, and which one are they going to make? And then just write 3 of every scene until I have a 500-page play. So who knows?
All right, let's sort of wrap up. We're right up to 7 o'clock. I guess first we want to thank Jeremy for coming and giving us a big we are essentially Corey, myself, Tony, and Tom are planning to take Jeremy to dinner. But before we do that, there's about 10 minutes if you want to, people want to talk about and sort of chat more formally and so on. Okay? All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.